Smart from K Smart Associates to provide his presentation on the Swaley Drain update electronically. Welcome, Mr. Smart, to the meeting, and please proceed with your presentation.
Thank you. We appreciate the opportunity to do this. Curtis McIntyre, who is my assistant and understudy, will be actually running the video portion of the presentation, and I'll be doing the audio. And there was some discussion whether we should, or I should, go through the full presentation and then answer any questions there may be, or if I should address questions as we go along. I don't think there was a firm decision made, so it's whatever approach you wish us to follow, we'll go along with it. But,
I think, Mr. Smart, because we're all very interested in this, I think if a councillor puts up their hand, then we'll ask a question at the particular point in time, if you don't mind us doing that.
Sure. Yeah, I may not see the hand raising, so if I continue to talk, just tell me there is a question, and I'll pause.
Thank you.
Very good.
Ken, before you get going, can everybody see the screen share that I'm sharing?
Yes, we have a copy of that presentation.
Okay, all right.
All right, well, let's go to the first page then, Curtis. This is a brief summary of the time that has elapsed since we submitted our scoping report almost 2 years ago, or a bit more than 2 years ago. Many of you will remember that the scoping report recommended that we proceed with a preliminary report, which indeed did happen. And one of the first steps in that preliminary report process was to authorize an environmental study to be undertaken. This was a condition of the Nottawasaga Conservation Authority, of course, that this had to be undertaken before any detailed engineering work was completed. So we did authorize that study, and it has been fairly lengthy. There was more than 1 year of field activities, different birds and turtles, etc., had to be monitored, and the field work wasn't really completed until into 2019, and then the report itself was submitted to me in a draft format in November or December. We made various comments on it. We were happy with the initial recommendations of it. And following my submission of comments, the environmental consultant then resubmitted his report, and this occurred back in January or February. I just forget now when it exactly was. And we then had a meeting up in Minising with Steve Buchanan and with a contractor that could possibly do that type of work, just to have input from a construction perspective. So after that meeting, our comments to the environmental consultant were refined a bit further, and he then submitted his further draft just roughly a month or so ago. And I think his draft report is in fairly good condition at this point. And maybe just leaping ahead a little bit, he has now notified the NVCA that it is going to be submitted to them shortly, and they've responded and have acknowledged that they will review it as quickly as they can. So let's go to the next slide, Curtis. So the recommended work in the Swaley Drain is twofold, although the second phase may or may not be acceptable. But the primary activity is to go into the wetlands for approximately 950 meters downstream of the existing Swaley outlet. And hopefully we will lower the water levels that are high in the Swaley by somewhere in the magnitude of 16 to 18 inches, which would then substantially improve the condition of the tile outlets upstream on the Gilroy property and even further upstream on the Kamak property. There has always been a consideration that we should do some work at the muskrat, what we call the muskrat outlet area, which is where the muskrat initially joined to the river. Of course, that junction has been blocked for some time now, and the waters, the wetland waters above the Muskrat, now overflow into the Downey drain. But there's always been a consideration that we should do some work there, and the preliminary report that I will issue will recommend that we do about approximately 300 meters of work there. But the environmental report is not so positive on doing work at the Muskrat area because of the impacts, not just in the wetlands, but in the access to the work area. The reports, both the environmental consultants and mine, will no doubt talk of this work at the Muskrat area as being work that can be done if it's necessary and when it's necessary. And maybe leaping ahead a little bit right now, that work at the Muskrat area might only lower the wetland waters in the magnitude of 6 inches at that location. And given that it's 3 or 4 kilometers downstream of the Swaley drain, that lowering may never be observed upstream at the Swaley because of the wetland vegetation that is there. But my position is that if we can do it, we should do it because it gives us some cushion. So having said that, let's go to the next slide. This is a plan view. It shows the general relationship of everything. On the left side is the Nottawasaga and the heavy line. And then the Willow Creek is the squiggly line that goes to the south from that and then turns east towards George Johnson's Road. The two work areas have the circles around them. The left circle is at the Muskrat Outlet area. You can see, or hopefully see, the route of the Downey drain, which is a more solid or continuous line. And then below that is a more squiggly line, which would be the Muskrat remnants. We call it the remnants because the channel is you can't see the channel because of the wetland waters. We don't believe it's truly consistent, but we don't know. There's just too much water above it almost continuously. But that is the Muskrat Outlet area. And then the other circle is the Swaley, what we call the Swaley Outlet area. It shows the existing Swaley drain where it discharges, and it runs into the Muskrat remnants, which sort of are at the top of that circle. We're recommending the improvement run more westerly in the north part of lot 10, I believe it is. And it would follow the historic route of the Swaley drain. The Swaley drain initially did run almost fully across concession 11 and hit what was at that point the Muskrat drain back in the early 1900s, and the Muskrat Creek rather then flowed generally northerly and northwesterly, etc. We're trying to follow, we are recommending that we follow that route of the original Swaley drain and the original Muskrat Creek. A couple of reasons. First of all, from a legal perspective, we feel we have more legal ability to do that. And then secondly, we feel there are substantial sediments in the area immediately downstream of the Swaley drain. We believe this happened when there were breaches of the Willow Creek back in the, I guess, around the Hurricane Hazel period, and perhaps sometime prior to that. But we believe there are sediments in that area, and by following this route, we feel we bypass the sediment areas. Next slide. This is a bit of the remainder, I guess you could say, of the Swaley drain watershed. It just shows in that heavy dashed line the perimeter of the Swaley drain watershed. We have tried to update that Swaley watershed as part of our preliminary report work, and you will see when the preliminary report is submitted. I know I've sent it in draft to Heather and Steve, but there is a listing of all the properties and of the hectares that we believe are involved. And those would be the properties that are within that dashed heavy line perimeter. It's a bit of an update from the most recent previous Swale watersheds. There was one done in the 1970s and updated in the 2003 period, and we believe there are some updates necessary from that. And what we show here represents the watershed that we suggest would be assessed towards the cost of any work that is done. Next slide. This is an enlargement of the Swale outlet area. On the upper right-hand side of the slide is the existing Swale drain. You can see it hooks it just into lot 9 a bit, and that green line downstream is the muskrat remnants, as best we know. The muskrat remnants are overlaid by 0.6 to 1.1 meters of water throughout, and that's more summer, fall type of conditions. Much more water in the spring, obviously. The dashed line, the line work with one long line and 2 dashes represents the original Swale route. And that heavy solid line that it discharges into is the original muskrat route. That shows in the engineer's drawings of the early 1900s period. So our recommended work at the Swale end is the blue line. We would try to follow much of that original route, approximately 500 to 550 meters in the east-west direction, and then 350 to 400 meters in the north-south direction, and hit the muskrat remnants sort of in the upper half of Lot 9, Concession 11. And that would be the 950 meters of length. Those lighter areas around the green line are in part, we believe, sediments, but if indeed they are not the sediments, that is where we believe the sediments are. Next slide. This is the work at the muskrat end. You can see the river. It's quite distinctive, flowing sort of on the left part of the slide. The Downey drain is the more continuously man-made channel that's up in the upper half of the slide. The green line is where we believe the muskrat remnants are. We base that on photography. We reviewed photography in the 1954, 1986, 1990, various periods. And the muskrat was more evident in some of that earlier photography. And that line is based on the most recent photography before waters substantially overlaid the muskrat. The black line at the top is actually where the muskrat was, we believe, in the 1954 period precisely, and then that green line is in more recent years. The work that we're recommending, we did look at 2 areas. I think maybe many of council will remember that we initially talked of trying to make a better connection of the muskrat remnants to the Nottawasaga River. And that lower blue line in the east-west direction is that suggested connection to the river. Whereas the upper line is a connection to the Downey drain. Now, to give a little bit of talk about the connection to the river, we would try to go in to the river a bit further downstream at a bend in the river if we were going to do it. And we would have to break through the levee or the high bank that's along the river. Presently, that bank is about 1 meter higher than any of the other grounds, so that bank would have to be lowered 1 meter. And even by going into the river, the maximum lowering that we could obtain in the wetlands above the muskrat remnants would be about 6 inches, 150 millimeters.
Ken,
Yes.
we'll pause for a question here. Councillor Ritchie.
Sure.
Thank you, Mayor Allen. Ken, these routes that you're proposing here, I'm assuming you've surveyed these, and how are they for fall as far as getting the water away, which is the whole objective behind this exercise. I hope that's something that's kept in mind going through this, is that there's fall to get the water flowing.
Well, there is actually very little fall. What exists is it, if you can picture it, it's almost like a lake at that area. That whole area east of the treat area is overlaid with water continuously. So all we can do is take advantage of water levels, and we would dig a channel, and I've got some profiles here we'll come to in a minute. We can get some fall in the channel, but the channel itself is not so much to get the water moving. The channel itself would be done to stop the vegetation from returning. Just as exists at the Swaley outlet right now, there's hardly any fall at the Swaley outlet, but there's a channel visible. And the reason that the channel there has not been clogged with wetland grasses is because it was excavated perhaps 20 inches into the topsoils or the original organic soils that existed prior to the wetlands creation. And that excavation has stopped the vegetation from returning. And that's indeed what we would do at the Muskrat end. Whether we went into the river or went into the Downey drain, we would be trying to excavate about 20 inches out of the native soils, the organics, and stop the vegetation from returning. The only drop in the water level would be what's available from the various outlets. If we went into the Nottawasaga River, we could lower the water levels by 6 inches. If we went into the Downey drain, better. As I said, the waters go there right now. If you can see the intersection of concessions 12 and 13 and lots 9 and 10, right at that corner, yes, that's about where. We believe it's right in that area where the wetland waters above the Muskrat right now wander or meander through the woods and go into the Downey drain. That's the outlet for those waters right now above the Muskrat. And what we would be doing by trying to go to the Downey drain with that blue line is to avoiding going into the treed area. And what we could obtain by going into the Downey drain at the most would be 12 inches of lowering, but we suspect that that would be unacceptable. We believe if we can go into the Downey drain, we can probably hope for the best, maybe of 6 inches of water lowering. And that would be achieved by just basically digging a canal. And that canal would be the 20 inches of topsoil, sediment removals, and then just having standing water in that canal. And that would eventually lower the water levels at the Muskrat end. And as I said earlier, whether that would ever transpire into a lowering up at the Swaley end is something that we don't know, because there's such a big gap in between and so much wetland grasses, and the whole area is a lake, basically from that point up to the Swaley as well. But just to give you an appreciation, the environmental consultant has identified many more potential problems with species by working at this Muskrat end. And I believe his final report is going to say that we should only do the work at this Muskrat end if we find it's necessary. And he will be suggesting that we do work at the Muskrat end, or I'm sorry, at the Swaley end first, and only consider this Muskrat end if it's needed. I personally believe that the work that's required for the landowners along the Swaley drain can be provided by doing work at the Swaley end only. This work at the Muskrat end, as I said, would be a cushion. It might transpire into some lowering over time. It might also help any future increase in the wetlands water levels at that location. By doing a connection to the Downey, or a better connection, I should say, to the Downey drain, and assuming the Downey always remains open across lot, lot 5, concession 12, to where it joins the river, then the water levels in the Muskrat area would be controlled by the river levels, which are basically flat across that portion of the Downey. We've surveyed up the Downey drain. We had a boat, and the fellows had their GPS and total station system, and they They took elevations along that route. There's very little fall in the Downey Drain. I can't read the numbers there myself. Maybe you can, but there's probably only 3 or 4 inches of fall in the Downey Drain itself from where that blue line would join to where the river is. And the best we could hope for is that the Downey Drain remains unobstructed in that area if we were counting on it to continue to provide service to the Muskrat area. So long story short is that there is perhaps a cushion by doing this work into the Downey Drain. I don't believe we would ever get approval to go into the river. And as I said, there's more to be gained by going to the Downey Drain in any case, but because of sturgeon in the river, because of, I think the consultant found bats or whatever in the trees, he's trying to, his report basically discourages any work in the bush area on the east side of the river or into the river itself. And I suspect that his opinion will be echoed by the Conservation Authority. Next slide. This is a profile. This profile is at the Swaley end, and I'm going to refer to my text because the screen isn't quite large enough. But if you look on the left side of that profile, the upper dashed line represents the water level, and the lower part of that profile is where we would start work 950 meters downstream of the Swaley. And then where it says 0 + 0 0 down at the bottom of the profile, that's the existing end of the Swaley Drain. And you can see there's a substantial fall in the water level. Well, substantial for that area. That's where we would obtain the 16 to 18 inches of drop of the water levels. And if you continue to the right, following that dashed line, and then the next group of letters are the Gilroy outlet. And you might be able to see a small egg shape, a vertical egg at that location. That represents Will Gilroy's main tile outlet. And you can see how much water is presently above it. And you can see the lowered water level that would be that would result from going downstream this 950 meters. And that's probably the best I think we can do. I don't think doing work at the Muskrat end will do anything further there. But as I said, it might just help it worsening in future years. Continuing to the right on that profile, further upstream across George Johnson Road, you can see another egg there. That represents a submerged pipe on the Haight property. And then going further to the right is the tile outlets on the Kamak property. They're presently below water. They aren't as far below water as Will Gilroy's, but you can see the expected drop in the water levels there with this work that we're recommending at the Swaley outlet.
Ken, follow-up question, please?
Sure.
Councillor Ritchie.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor Allen. To go back to the next slide there, I'm curious to know, Ken, when I look at the Downey Drain, where does the Downey Drain presently drain into?
Boy, it goes into the river. That point where Curtis is running that little finger there, that is the outlet of the Downey Drain into the river. Right
But
there.
I'm not seeing that. It just shows the bush. Like, is there?
I know. That area needs some repair. It's greatly overgrown. There are some fallen trees in that portion of the Downey Drain.
And why isn't that being looked at?
Well, good question. I think past maintenance that's been undertaken in the Downey Drain has basically only started at the lot 5-6 line and gone upstream. I don't believe there has been any activity downstream. Why? I don't know. I believe that Mr. Downey would like to see it done. There's been some discussions that perhaps it should be done. It is a drain. It can be done through the drainage superintendent's process. It's not critical for what we're doing on the Swaley drain, but I would still suggest that it should be pursued. That work should be pursued as drain maintenance. If nothing else, I would remove the fallen trees and maybe do some clearing back, just to open up the canopy, the tree canopy there. But it is very hard to see from an aerial, but it is there. We've got handheld photos all along there, and it's not a bad channel. As I said, there are some fallen trees in it, but you can go through it by boat. I think there has been maybe some past beaver activity, but I don't. There was no evidence that any dams were causing any blockages at this time. But it certainly could use some drain maintenance. And
Is that a sensitive area? Are we going to wait for another 4 or 5 years to get this done? Where, it might just require, in the winter months, a machine to go in there or whenever and pull out the trees, get the water flowing. I see it goes right into the Nottawasaga River, so we know that's all sensitive area along there. So those are concerns that I have, and how do we address that?
Yes, it is sensitive, I'm sure, in the opinion of the Conservation Authority and others. That channel, just for information, was dug in the 1930s by a provincial or a federal government program, and then it was actually incorporated as the Downey Drain in 1961. I don't know if it's had that much maintenance on it since it was brought into the Downey Drain back in the 60s, but that's something that perhaps Steve or someone at your level could find out if there has been any past maintenance on it, but it certainly should be considered. My report is recommending that if this work of joining the muskrat remnants, joining the muskrat remnants to the Downey is made, that the watershed of the Swaley Drain then be partially responsible for any maintenance downstream, for any clean out of that portion of the Downey Drain from where we join down to the river. So from a timing perspective, it may be appropriate to have the work done so the report on the Swaley Drain is there, making that recommendation, and then the Downey Drain watershed is modified, and then the work could be done so that a larger watershed could be assessed towards that work. At the same time, or simultaneous with that, discussions with ourselves, yourselves, and the Conservation Authority should occur as to undertaking the work through the Drainage Superintendent's Program. The work could actually be done perhaps by the same contractor, maybe a different contract, but the same contractor, just from a cost efficiency perspective, if and when the Swaley work is done. The concern I have is that we have to make sure, or we'd recommend that the work that we're doing on the Swaley Drain be acceptable before we proceed too far with any suggestions that the Swaley be responsible for the Downey. But having said that, there's nothing to prohibit activities commencing now to do some improvement work of the Downey Drain, whether our work of joining to it is undertaken or not.
Okay, thank you. Next.
Okay, go back to that profile, Curtis, if you can. There we are. I think those are the majority of my comments on the profile. Yes, that's right. We had moved to the cross-section, hadn't we? Yes, go to the cross-section. All right, this is the cross-section at the Swaley end. And the top cross-section represents the existing Swaley Drain. And it shows that the water width at the Swaley where it presently terminates is about 7.5 meters, which would be what, about 22, 23 feet or something of that magnitude. The old spoil that was excavated out of it is primarily submerged. You can see the water level. The water level is right at the top of those old spoil berms. And that crosshatch area is where the contractor, when he last excavated the swale drain, dug into the organics by that half meter plus or minus. So that's the condition at the existing swale end. Then down below is what we're recommending in the 950 meters of work that would go downstream of it. And you can see in the center portion of that cross section, the similar crosshatch area where we go into the organic soils, approximately about a 20-foot width, which would mirror the overall greater depth of the existing swale. But to do the work, and this is very, very critical, and maybe most of you are aware of this, the only way that we feel this work can be done is by barge. We had hoped that we could do it by an excavator working on mats, but there's just too much water there. Mats can only be used when there's less than half a meter of water, less than 20 inches, desirably 18 inches of water. And we have between 24 inches and 42 inches of water consistently in the area where we want to work. So the only way that we can do this is by barge or by what is called a high float excavator. High float excavators are excavators with tracks on them that are somewhere in the magnitude of 3 to 4 feet in height. They're used in the wetlands of Louisiana in the southern part of the states. There was once one in Ontario, but it's not in operation anymore. We had hoped that there would be rental firms that would be acquiring one for rent, but there is no activity in that regard. We placed numerous calls, Quebec, Ontario, even out west, to try to find sources of a high float excavator, and drew blanks everywhere. We actually had one large rental firm do a search for us. The only way we could get a high float excavator at this time is to bring it in from the southern states, which would be prohibitive from a cost perspective. So the only way this work can be done is by an excavator sitting on a barge. And if it is done by that process, the barge takes 30 feet. You'd have to remove wetland grasses for a width of 30 feet. So, and the barge requires a minimum of 3 feet of water to work. That means that at the existing swale end, we would have to dig what we could call as a sediment pool or a habitat pool or whatever you want to call it, but for all intents, it's a pool that would allow the barge to be launched. Approximately 150 meters downstream from the swale, 200 meters, there is enough water already. There's over 3 feet of water that we wouldn't have to do this over digging. We could just do the 6 meter wide channel. But to get to that point where we have to start, we have to basically excavate a pool to let this barge go. And I think you maybe noticed from my text, the environmental consultant has said the work has to be done in the winter from the species perspective. And talking to a contractor, we talked to a contractor with a barge. We've had contractors do work in the Holland Marsh with barges, obviously. And he said that if work has to be done in the winter, it has to be done in the early part of the winter. In other words, you can't have a lot of ice buildup. The ideal time to do this work would be December, January, that type of period. Winter conditions, but before heavy buildups of ice. So that's a brief description of the work that we will be recommending at the swale end if our environmental consultant is able to get NVCA on board.
Question, Ken? Question, Ken, please, Councillor Ritchie?
Thank you. Ken, have you looked into any outfits, companies, excavation outfits in the Bradford Marsh area that are digging out canals? Is there any outfits down there that would have that expertise or similar kind of equipment to facilitate this job that we're looking at?
Yes, we have. As a matter of fact, the contractor that we spoke to, the contractor that Steve and I had up to the fire hall at Menacing back in January, was the contractor that did the majority of the work in the Holland Marsh. He is a contractor that has normal excavators. He has what are called long reach excavators, plus he has a barge system. And he has used the barge to maintain what's called the Central River through the Holland Marsh system. And he's the fellow that we spoke to I guess, pick his brain as to how this work could be done. And he confirmed that it could be done by barge, but he would need 3 feet of water to work it. And he also gave us an estimate of cost to do it. And any estimates of cost that I will be submitting will be based on his estimate to do the work. Now, obviously, the work would have to go to tender, but in all honesty, there are very few people, very few firms, I should say, that would be capable of supplying a barge and being able to do that work. So we might have a very limited response when it comes time to tender, if, and desirably, hopefully that we get to that point.
Follow up?
Thank you, Mayor Allen. Just to get back to that, the environmental consultant is recommending winter, and the contractor's saying we need 3 feet of water. That kind of brings me forward into the early parts of the spring, where you see a lot of flooding, which would give us that 3 feet in order to float that barge to get the work done. Like, I don't know, I don't think there's anything stirring in March or April, and if we get a spring flooding, that flooding, which would be actually to our benefit in order to get that done. So is there any way of getting that guy to extend it into that time frame in order to make this work? Only a couple of months ain't going to make any difference to get this thing moving forward.
That was exactly my thought too, but unfortunately, spring from an environmental perspective is the worst possible time to do the work. We both mentioned that, both myself and the contractor asked why we couldn't do it. Well, I knew the answer because I'd already seen Al's report, and Al Shaw, the environmental consultant. And his report talks in various locations about the various species there. And his recommendation under each species says recommendations, and just about every recommendation is to do the work in the winter conditions, not in spring conditions, because that apparently is the worst possible time. Like when we'd like to do it after or during the spring freshet when the Nottawasaga floods, obviously lots of water to do it. Ideal time for the barge contractor, but the worst possible time from the environmental perspective. So yeah, we pursued that. I didn't pursue it too far because I knew what his report was saying, but it would be desirable from a construction perspective if we could do that. But my opinion is, I'm hoping that we get the approval to do it at the winter time. That's what I'm hoping.
Okay, one more question, please.
Thank you, Mayor Allen. Are we going to get a chance to see this environmental report and to speak to this guy, or at least read the report?
Oh, for sure, yes. His report will be part of my report. It'll be an appendix to my report. I think I might have, I can't remember if I sent a draft, his initial draft to Steve or not, but the recommendations at that time didn't really recognize that the water levels were consistent through there. And, you know, there was fine tuning of his report in the period of November through to January. And it culminated in that meeting with a contractor where we confirmed that the only way we could do this is by barge because of the water levels. So his report now would be at a position that I would suggest is realistic. It perhaps wasn't realistic as far as the construction activities back in December. It was realistic from the environmental perspective, but not from the construction perspective. Now I believe it's realistic from both perspectives, and that's why I've asked him to submit it to NVCA, which I understand will be happening either this week or next week.
Okay, thank you. Next slide.
Next slide, Curtis. This is the work at the Muskrat end, if we do it, when we do it. Fortunately, water levels aren't as high at the end at the Muskrat end where we'd want to work. If we did do a connection to the Downey drain, we could work in probably a bit less than 2 feet of water over the majority of the length. So that work could actually be done by a normal excavator working on mats in that portion. Channel wouldn't have to be as large. We'd probably clear about 20 feet of wetland vegetation, and maybe the channel would be a little bit less in the bottom. But the key would be to obtain at least 15 feet plus or minus of 20 inches of removal of the organics at the bottom. So that bottom slide shows the existing conditions. You can see the water levels there, the wetland grasses, and the strata that we want to work in. I should mention that the upper slide, that is the channel that was excavated in the 1900s, plus or minus, into the river. At that time, they excavated about 500 feet of channel through the wooded area along the east side of the river to join the Muskrat to the river, to better join the Muskrat to the river at that time. Of course, at that time, the Muskrat area was still under private ownership, and I think people were logging it and whatever, there's many more trees in it, whatever. It just wasn't outletting that well, so that's why the engineer at that time recommended that work be done. Unfortunately, the engineer at that time did not make it part of the drain. He recommended it be done, but he never brought it into his report. So that work has no legal status, unfortunately. The remnants of that channel is still there. Our surveyors have seen it, Conservation Authority have seen it, but as I said, nobody will let us, well, the recommendations are strongly against using that channel or improving it. But that line down below it is how we would improve that channel if we were to use it. And that's why the footnote there says Route 1 is strongly discouraged by the environmental consultant, and the environmental consultant advises Route 2 is a possibility if needed and accepted by the agencies. Next slide. So, upcoming steps from here. Al Shaw and myself have been trying to fine-tune the reports. We feel that has been done. Al Shaw has notified the Conservation Authority that his report is going to be submitted. I think he's been talking to Glenn Featherstone there, and Glenn has responded, I believe, and has advised Al that he will make every effort to review it in the coming weeks or so when it's submitted. So we're hoping that that review goes well. And then Al also has to talk to the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, maybe more so now because they're a landowner. At one point, they were responsible for species at risk, but that responsibility has now been transferred to the Ministry of Environment, and I forget now what all the CP stands for. Curtis, what is the full MECP? Do you know? Or maybe Curtis is muted.
Ministry of the Environment, Conservation, and Parks, Ken.
Okay, yes. Anyways, they are now responsible for species at risk. I should have known that, but a mental lapse here. But they are responsible for species at risk. So Al also has to talk to MECP about his report.
All right, he might be done soon.
Was that a question? I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
No, it was, go ahead, please, Ken.
Oh, okay. Anyways, fortunately, Al has a contact at Ministry of Natural Resources in Jody Benvenuti, and our old Lake Simcoe Region Conservation Authority contact the biologist with LSRCA, is now a biologist with MECP, and we know him quite well. And I should say Al Shaw was our environmental consultant all the way through our Holland Marsh project. So Al and I have worked together for 10 plus years, I suppose, and he's the reason why, or that's the reason why we asked him to be responsible for this project. But what I was going to say is he does have a good contact with MECP. We're hoping that that particular individual will be the person that reviews it in this area. We think this is his area, but we're not positive. But Al is going to be contacting both Jody and what's his last name? Yeah, I just forget his name, but he was involved with LSRCA for the first, I'd say 4 or 5 years of our project until our reports were adopted. Once construction started down there, he moved on. He initially went to DFO, and now he's back with MEC, or he is with MECP. So next point is that if all these agencies, go back to that slide, Curtis, please. If all those agencies are reasonably okay with the report, then what I would like to do is have some type of a meeting. We have to decide how we do it with the main landowners, and that would be, say, Gilroy, Walton, Haight, Kamak, Downey, and many others right in that immediate area, and tell them what our reports are recommending. Then I would like also to have a general presentation of all owners, and again, we have to think about how we can do this because of the COVID thing. But I would like everybody to know what the reports are going to say before I actually issue my preliminary report. And then, if all goes well, ideally my preliminary report could be issued perhaps in August. That's a moving target because of environmental agencies, because of COVID thing. Like, we have a great problem like everybody else that we've only got half our staff working, so to get work done, it's not going that fast. And I'm sure the reviews won't be as fast as we'd like, but maybe they will, because maybe the agencies aren't doing anything else that they will be able to devote their time to our project. Next slide. So then the longer term steps, if we do submit our preliminary report in August, that has to be considered by council. Council has to have a formal council meeting to consider that. If council is satisfied with the report and satisfied with the landowners' input with respect to the report, there's no opportunity for any formal submission by the landowners. It's more just listening to what everybody's position is. But then council would have to decide whether they want to authorize our firm to submit the final report. And if they do, then it would be a fairly short duration to submit the final report, because most of the work that we've done already is work that would be in the final report. This watershed determination, the list of the owners affected, that's a big activity, but we've already done that. So, once we get the okay from the agencies, and council's okay with the preliminary report, to go to that final report stage isn't going to take a lot of time. But there are a number of steps, as you are aware from past reports. Once a final report is submitted, you have to go through a formal consideration. You have to go through a court of revision, and then all the agencies have another kick of the can, you might say, on the final report. So it might be into March or April of 2021 before we're at a point where we can say we can start tendering. And so desirably, we could tender in the summer or fall of 2021 and have a contract ready to go in early winter of 2021. But that's the best seen scenario as I see it right now. I did put in another slide about maintenance. The Conservation Authority has already raised questions about this, and I'm sure the landowners will too. If we do this work, how often are we going to have to repeat it? Well, my opinion is, just viewing the existence of the Swaley drain, which we think was perhaps last maintained in the 1990s. I've seen conflicting reports. It might have been maintained more recently, but only upstream. I think the portion downstream hasn't been maintained since perhaps the 1990s, and that's close to 30 years ago. And the vegetation condition there is quite good. And I think it's because they did go that extra depth into the organics, and that's why we're recommending that we do the same thing. So having said that, I'm hoping that a costly maintenance won't have to be done for perhaps 40 years. But I would recommend to Steve or whoever the drainage superintendent is that occasionally a small boat be launched going down through Will Grower's property along the berm of the existing swale and launch a boat and just review the work that we do. And if there is any indication that wetland grasses are starting to emerge, that there be some mechanism to rake them out, whether it's a case of dragging some sort of harrow or something at the bottom just to get them out, something similar to that at a lower cost than launching and barging it. But we think if that's done, there shouldn't be any major maintenance activity for a number of years.
Ken, a question from Deputy Mayor Coughlin?
Yes.
Thank you, Marilyn, and through you to Mr. Smart. The maintenance schedule moving forward, would that be something that could potentially be approved on a, I don't want to say decade basis, but is this something that we're going to have to seek approval for on an annual basis to do what's required, or will we receive approval to maintain the drain moving forward?
Well, it's a good question. Anytime Steve or any drainage superintendent does works of maintenance, he does have to do a project activity form. It has to be reviewed by the Conservation Authority and by Fisheries and Oceans. Normally, if it's an existing drain, the procedure to obtain approval to maintain an existing drain isn't that exhaustive. It's something the superintendent does by himself. An engineer is not required, but there's quite often criteria when you do it. You can't do it at fish spawning season, and perhaps up in that area again, any maintenance that's done will have to be done in the early winter if it is done. But it shouldn't be that onerous to do it once the report is adopted. Getting the report in place is the big step. And then it's a case of when do you have to do it, and then when you do have to do it, there are certain steps you have to follow, but they really aren't onerous.
Okay. Comments?
Next slide.
Comment slide, thank you.
I just addressed, when I first drafted this presentation, there was some thought that perhaps maybe we should be in there in the winter. Like I think we were talking about this maybe back in December, January of 2019, 2020. But as I pointed out in my first draft of this presentation, that we just can't do it. We're so far away from having agency approvals and having the reports processed through the Drainage Act that we can't do it. And then as I've said here now is that once everything is approved, we can't really do the work until we have a winter condition. So we thought maybe initially we might be okay to do it in the winter of 2021, but it's just not going to be practical. I think we're looking at the winter of 21, 22. So I think that's everything, but we would certainly go to the next slide. Again, I thank council for the opportunity to present this, describe the work, and we would like any feedback that you wish to make too.
Okay, thank you.
Considered in everything we're doing.
Thank you, Ken and Curtis. When would be the first time that we would start to get some numbers attributed to this?
Like from a cost perspective?
Yes.
Well, I have actually worked through costs, and I haven't put them in that presentation. They're in my preliminary report, but we're looking at if we were to do both ends at the same time, the swale drain and the and the muskrat end, we're probably looking somewhere in the area of $320,000. The cost to do the muskrat end is very high. It's somewhere in the area of $60,000 to do that muskrat end, whereas to do the downy or the swaley end is somewhere in the area of $70,000. So, you know, it's a significant cost to go into that muskrat end as well as the environmental impacts. If we didn't have to, or we couldn't do, whatever word you want to use, the muskrat end, we're probably looking at a cost of somewhere in the area of $260,000.
Now-
And that scoping report that I submitted had an assessment schedule in there. It showed, or not an assessment schedule, but a cost distribution schedule, I guess you could say, based on the previous report. And it showed how I would distribute a cost of $300,000. That's the number that I had at that time. I think I felt at that time, though, the cost would be closer to $200,000 than $300,000. But nonetheless, that scoping report showed how the cost could be distributed for $300,000. And just to give you an idea what the impact would be, if a fella had a 100-acre farm in the upper watershed, and if we did the $320,000 plus or minus project with both ends, the net assessment, assuming that landowner had the farm property class tax rate and was subject to or eligible for the provincial grant, the net assessment would be about $3,500 for each 100-acre farm. And if the only the swaley end were done, it might be in the area of $2,700. That's our best projections at this time. But I don't want to put a lot of weight on that because we don't know yet what comments may come back from the agencies. There could be requests that some other type of mitigation work be included. We feel actually that this pool that we'd be doing at the swaley end would be a substantial bit of mitigation because it would give variable habitat. It would present an area for sediment collection if sediment should come down. We don't feel that recent sediment activity in the swaley has been high. There's no evidence in the last 15, 20 years where that has been provided that there's been a substantial buildup of sediments in the swaley. So we don't think sediments would be a problem, but nonetheless, this launch area of the barge would present varied habitat plus a sediment pooling area if necessary. So whether there'll be any more recommendations, we don't know. Al has thought that, and I've budgeted a bit for it, that we may want to consider creating some artificial turtle nesting locations as we did in the marsh. Not cost expensive activities, but something that you know is well received when you do that. So.
Ken, does the $350,000 cost include doing the work that we discussed on the extension of the Downey Drain over to the river?
No, it does not. No.
And do you have any
No.
ballpark what would be required with respect to that?
Not really. It would depend on how the work was done. You know, again, you could conceivably bring the barge down there. The barge wouldn't be brought down to do this work at the muskrat end that we're talking of, but there would have to be something similar to have the excavator cross the Downey Drain to get into that area. And I asked the contractor whether bringing sections of the barge, like the barge is actually put together in 3 sections. They're bolted together to make a big enough platform for an excavator, but they can be moved in individual lengths. And I thought perhaps we could use 2 lengths of the barge just to make the bridge across the Downey Drain to do this. But apparently there isn't sufficient width in the Downey Drain to do that. So the way that he would cross the Downey Drain is using a reinforced equivalent to an old truck frame that would be used to span the Downey Drain to get across. So the idea of using the barge to go down and do that work wouldn't necessarily work out, but it wouldn't prevent him from, or a contractor from mobilizing and bringing the barge down to that area and going in. The problem is, though, yeah, that's right, I forgot about that. The problem is the Downey is not wide enough, even to use two sections, and it would be very tricky having an excavator on just two sections of the barge doing that. So realistically, to do that portion of the Downey drain, we'd probably have to do it in a traditional fashion of an excavator going down and clearing a path along one side of it and sitting there and basically removing any debris, fallen trees that is in the channel. We don't think the channel bottom itself is a problem. It's just the fallen trees that are in it that would have to be removed. To do that kind of work with an excavator, you might be looking a couple of weeks, perhaps, I don't know, $3,000 a day, maybe $30,000, maybe.
Okay.
Might do it.
All right, I had a
That's
question.
the ballpark.
I had a question from Councillor Chapman and then Deputy Mayor Coghlan.
Thank you, Mayor Allen, to Mr. Smart. Just a question, would the homeowners be responsible for any of the costs, or is it all put on us, I guess?
No, if that work were done, and if our work on the Swaley drain were done, the cost would be assessed to both the Downey drain watershed plus the Swaley drain watershed. Now, the Swaley drain watershed is about 4 times the size of the Downey drain watershed. If memory serves me right, there's somewhere in the area of 600, 700 acres assessed into the Downey drain, and there's closer between 2,500, 2,800, I think, into the Swaley drain. So those costs would be distributed against, you might say, over 3,000 acres. So it might be if it was just the lands paying, it might be a cost of $10 an acre, perhaps somewhere in that magnitude. But there would also be a share of that cost distributed to the municipality and to the agencies. I think maybe some of you will remember that in my scoping report, I suggested that roughly a third of the cost of any work on the Swaley drain be assessed to the municipality and to the agencies. Like if there was a $300,000 project, the municipality would probably have a cost of $100,000. Between the agencies, the county, there could be somewhere in the area of 30,000. So the balance is what's assessed to the landowners.
Okay, Deputy Mayor Coghlan?
Thank you, Marilyn, and if Councillor Mott doesn't have a follow-up.
No,
Thank you. So the assessment for the Downey would then be incorporated into the Swaley, or there would be two assessment schedules separate of each? And if you can just confirm, again, I thought I heard you say that 1/3 of the assessment was municipality, but I recall a number of 76%?
Yeah, you're on the last question first. Yes, about 1/3 would be to the municipality, plus or minus. Well, the municipality and the downstream landowners, being the Conservation Authority and the Ministry of Natural Resources. The first question, yes, what would happen if this Swaley work, if my report is finally adopted in the Swaley drain, there would be a recommendation that the maintenance schedule on the Downey drain be modified to include the Swaley watershed for that downstream portion. So there would actually be what's called a Section 76 report prepared on the Downey drain. Not a very costly thing to do. The cost of going to meetings would be the biggest part, but there would have to be an engineering report to modify the maintenance schedule on the Downey drain so that the Swaley watershed shares in the cost downstream. And as I said, the Swaley drain would probably pay 3/4 of any of the cost of doing work on that portion of the Downey drain.
Follow on?
And thank you. And then would the updated assessment schedule for the affected and benefiting landowners be included as we move forward with communication to the public?
The Preliminary report cannot contain any assessment schedules, but it suggests what can be done. The final report would have an assessment schedule to actually assess out the cost of the Swaley. And if we did any work at the Muskrat end, it would have that schedule as well. But that report on the Swaley drain that I'm prepared would not have a schedule on the Downey drain. Now, if council, if we thought for sure that the reports were going to be adopted, there is a mechanism where council could make an appointment in advance under section 76 to do the the Downey assessment schedule at the same time and include it with the Swaley drain. But we'd be a bit presumptuous that everything is going to occur as is recommended, but it could be made part of it if that was council's wish to do that. That's something that I could discuss with Heather or Steve as we get closer in time. Let's just say it's a possibility.
Okay, other, follow on further?
And thank you. The last assessment schedule presented, from my recollection in Minising, has there been work done on the assessment schedule with new drainage or new tile to have a better understanding of which lands are actually draining into this Swaley? Or are we going based on what we've seen previously?
No, there has been a fair bit of activity. Actually, that's what I was working on a fair bit while the environmental consultant was doing his work. I updated the Swaley Drain watershed. We did a fairly substantial review in Minising itself because there's been a fair change in the watershed there. And we did a fairly good review further upstream in concession 8. Just scroll to that slide. Yeah, in that area where the old rail line went through, now it's a trail. There were various watershed adjustments that we felt had to be done in that area, and we're aware that Mr. Kamak perhaps drained a bit more land into the Swaley drain in that area, but that watershed that is shown tries to recognize that. So we believe that the watershed that we have there is correct, but we do suggest that when the preliminary report comes out, that all landowners should review it and comment on it before we get to the point of the final report. So if there were any questions or disagreements, they could be reviewed before our final report was submitted. But when we talk about this cost being distributed, all the lands within that watershed will be listed in my preliminary report. The acreage assessed will be there. So it would be a simple mathematical exercise to determine what share any landowner would have of any cost that would be done. But the actual assessment schedule wouldn't be there. It can't be there until you do a final report. Everybody'd have a pretty good idea at the preliminary report stage what their costs are going to be if the final report is submitted, adopted, and constructed.
Okay, just to get a chance, any other councillors have comments or questions? Yeah, I just want to see whether. Okay, Councillor Ritchie?
Thank you, Mayor Allen. Ken, has there been any environmentals done on the Downey drain at all? And if not, could the environmentals that have already been done, would that not provide enough to satisfy everybody without spending any more?
That's a good question. I don't know. The work of the environmental consultant hasn't been geared to doing the Downey drain, but he's aware of the Downey drain. It's conceivable that NBCA would want him to provide his comments if that part of the Downey drain were improved. I suspect that much of the habitat that exists would be similar to the habitat that exists along the east side of the river. You know, the bats in the trees. There's probably existence of sturgeon in the Downey drain, which would make it a little bit tougher to do. You certainly have to do the work at a non-spawning season. MECP would be no doubt more involved, and perhaps Fisheries and Oceans would be more involved with working in the Downey drain than they would be with our work in the Swaley drain, or even at that Muskrat end. So there would have to be submissions made, and I guess the best case scenario would be a timing consideration when the work was done. There may be requirements as to how the work is done also.
Okay, follow on, Councillor Ritchie.
Thank you, and I'll make this quick. I'm assuming this, the Downey Drain is regulated. It's a regulated area by the MVCA, that's one question. And question two, what length of, how long of a piece are we looking for here to get cleaned out on the Downey Drain?
Let's see, leave that slide right there. Where's our scale? Curtis, how good are your eyes? Can you see that scale? Here, I'll get my sketch out. I think it might be in the area of 15.
That scale, Ken, is 100 meters. So
100 meters.
this scale here, sorry, is 100 meters. So if we can, 100.
So 100, 200. Yeah, it looks like it would be somewhere in the area of 1,500 feet. I would think, 400 meters plus or minus.
Okay, any other questions or comments before we have a motion to receive the report? Okay, could I have a mover, Councillor Hannah, to receive?
Yes.
And Councillor Ma to second?
Yes.
That the presentation of Ken Smart of K Smart Associates regarding an update on the Swaley Drain be received for information. All those in favor? That is carried. Thank you, Ken and Curtis, very much.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to do this. We appreciate it. And I might say it's my first Zoom presentation to council. I thought it went well.
Good. Good. Okay, mover and seconder for the bylaw confirmation, Deputy Mayor Coughlin and Councillor Ritchie. Bylaw 2020-032 to confirm and adopt the proceedings of council at the special council meeting held on May 22, 20, listed herein, be signed and sealed by the mayor and clerk. All those in favor? Carried. Mover and seconder, Councillor Moore and Councillor Cabral to adjourn. That the special meeting of the Township of Springwater does now adjourn at 6:20 p.m. to meet again in regular meeting on May 26:30 p.m. Council Chambers, Admin Center, Minising. All those in favor? Carried. Thank you.
All right, we're going to sign off then, and thanks again for the opportunity.
Thank you.